A wealthy man was overwhelmed with guilt as he saw his son in a coma in the hospital. He regretted not being as present as he should have been. Suddenly, a parrot flew into the room and said surprising things. The wealthy man began to cry in disbelief. Before hearing this emotional story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Before you hear this moving story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Richard Miller was the kind of man who inspired both envy and admiration in equal measure. At 45, he had achieved everything most people only dreamed of: considerable wealth, a rapidly expanding tech company, and a reputation as one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. His face often graced the covers of business magazines, always with that confident smile that seemed to say, "I have everything under control." That Monday morning, Richard woke up in his luxurious penthouse overlooking Central Park. The sun had barely risen, but he was already up, ready for another day of conquests. As he shaved, he observed his reflection in the mirror. Well-trimmed grey hair, penetrating green eyes, and a posture that exuded authority. It was the image of a man on top of the world. "Good morning, sir," greeted Maria, the housekeeper, as she entered the room with a breakfast tray. "You have a video conference with the investors at 8 a.m. Richard nodded, barely paying attention. His mind was already focused on the strategies he would present, the numbers he would defend. The coffee remained untouched on the tray as he put on his custom-made Armani suit. Before leaving, Richard briefly stopped by the room next door. Through the half-open door, he saw his wife, Olivia, cradling little Gabe, just 8 months old. For a moment, something stirred in his chest, a pang of... what? Guilt? Regret? He quickly pushed the feeling away. There was no time for emotional distractions. "I'm leaving," he announced dryly. Olivia looked up, a mixture of disappointment and resignation in her gaze. "Richard, you promised you'd spend the afternoon with us today, remember? It's the day to take Gabe for his vaccinations." He hesitated for a second. "An important meeting came up. I can't miss it. You can handle this, right?" Without waiting for an answer, Richard left, the sound of his firm footsteps echoing down the hallway. In the elevator, he checked his messages. Dozens of unread emails, missed calls, appointment reminders. His world, his true world. In the garage, the driver was already waiting for him next to the gleaming black Porsche. Richard got into the vehicle, immediately opening his laptop. "To the office, Anthony, and try to avoid traffic. I have a video conference in 40 minutes. As the car wound its way through the streets of New York City, Richard barely noticed the city waking up around him. His mind was focused on graphs, projections, and market strategies. This was what he was good at. This was what defined him. At the office, the routine unfolded as always. Meetings, phone calls, decisions that moved millions. Richard was in his element, commanding his team with the precision of a maestro. Every problem that arose, he solved with relentless efficiency. Nothing escaped his control. It was in the middle of the afternoon, during a particularly tense meeting with the board, that the unexpected happened. His secretary, Patricia, entered the room with a pale face. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's an urgent call for you. It's from the hospital." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. Hospital. His mind immediately went to Olivia and Gabe. No, it couldn't be. He had control over everything, right? With slightly trembling hands, he picked up the phone. Richard Miller speaking. The voice on the other end was grave, professional. "Mr. Miller, this is Dr. Thompson from Mount Sinai Hospital. There's been an accident." The following words seemed to come from very far away. "Car accident. Olivia injured but stable. Gabe in critical condition. Coma." Richard's world, so carefully constructed and controlled, began to crumble. For the first time in years, he tasted the bitter flavor of fear, of helplessness. "I'm coming there now," he said, his voice unrecognizable even to himself. Leaving the meeting room without explanation, Richard ran to the elevator. His mind was a whirlwind. How could this happen? He should have been there. He should have gone with them to the appointment. Why didn't he go? In the car on the way to the hospital, Richard realized he was praying. He who had always trusted only in himself and his own power was now pleading with forces he couldn't see or control. The hospital was a maze of white, sterile corridors. Richard walked through them like an automaton, guided by nurses and signs. Finally, he reached the neonatal ICU. Through the glass, he saw his son. Gabe, so small and fragile, connected to tubes and machines. The boy he barely knew, for whom he never had time, was now fighting for his life. Olivia was there, sitting next to the crib, her arm bandaged and her face marked by tears and scratches. When she saw Richard, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and accusation. "Where were you?" she asked. Her voice choked. Richard had no answer. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say or do. His money, his power, his influence, none of it mattered now. He was just a desperate father, confronting the abyss of his own failures. As he watched his son fight for his life, Richard Miller, the man who thought he had everything under control, realized he had lost control of the only thing that really mattered. In the waiting room, Richard sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The smell of antiseptic, the beeps of the machines, the tense whispers of the doctors, it all seemed surreal. How could he, Richard Miller, the man who built an empire from nothing, feel so powerless? It was then that he noticed for the first time the cage in the corner of the room. Inside it, a parrot with vibrant plumage observed the scene with curious eyes. Richard vaguely remembered Olivia mentioning something about animal therapy for patients. The parrot tilted its head, its black eyes fixed on Richard. And then, to his surprise, the bird spoke. "You will lose everything." Richard blinked, stunned. Surely he had imagined it. But before he could process it, the parrot repeated, "He is coming back." The enigmatic words echoed in Richard's mind, mixing with the chaos of emotions he was struggling to contain. What did it mean? Who was coming back? And what more could he lose beyond what he already felt he had lost on that fateful day? As night fell over the hospital, Richard remained vigilant, torn between the ICU where his son fought for his life and the waiting room where the parrot's words continued to haunt him. One thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The hours dragged on at Mount Sinai Hospital, each minute weighing like an eternity on Richard Miller's shoulders. The once unshakable businessman now found himself reduced to a helpless observer, his eyes fixed on the small figure of Gabe, connected to a myriad of tubes and monitors in the neonatal ICU. Olivia had fallen asleep in an uncomfortable armchair next to the crib, her face marked by exhaustion and worry. Richard couldn't sleep. His world, once so ordered and predictable, now spun in a whirlwind of uncertainties and fears. The parrot's words echoed incessantly in his mind. "You will lose everything, and he is coming back." Richard tried to push these thoughts away, convincing himself that it was just stress playing tricks on his mind. But something inside him knew there was more to those words than he could explain. When the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the hospital blinds, Richard decided he needed some fresh air. He quietly left the ICU, promising himself he would return in a few minutes. In the hospital garden, Richard took a deep breath, feeling the morning air fill his lungs. It was then that he noticed an elderly gentleman sitting on a nearby bench, feeding pigeons with pieces of bread. Something about the man's serenity drew Richard in. "Good morning," the old man greeted with a gentle smile. "Looks like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Richard hesitated for a moment, but something in the man's expression made him sit down beside him. "My son," he began, surprised by his own willingness to confide in a stranger. "He's in the ICU. I don't know what to do." The old man nodded understandingly. "You know, young man, sometimes life brings us to our knees to teach us to look up." "What do you mean?" asked Richard, intrigued. "When we lose control, that's when we really start to live," the man replied, throwing more crumbs to the pigeons. "It's in that moment that we discover what really matters." The old man's words hit Richard like lightning. He had always lived for control, for power, but now, faced with the fragility of his son, all of that seemed so insignificant. "How can I help him?" Richard asked, more to himself than to the old man. "How can I be the father he needs?" The man smiled softly. "Start by being present, truly present. The rest will come naturally." When Richard returned to the ICU, something had changed inside him. He looked at Gabe with new eyes, not as a problem to be solved, but as a precious little life that needed his love and presence. Olivia woke up, finding Richard holding Gabe's hand through the opening in the crib. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, she saw vulnerability in her husband's gaze. "I'm sorry," Richard whispered, his voice choked. "For everything. For not being here, for—" Olivia placed her hand over his, gently interrupting him. You're here now. That's what matters." At that moment, Dr. Thompson entered the ICU, his face serious but not devoid of hope. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, we have the results of the latest tests." Richard and Olivia stood up, their hearts racing. The doctor continued, "Gabe's condition is still serious but stable. We've noticed some small responses to stimuli, which is a good sign. However, we still can't predict when or if he'll come out of the coma." The doctor's words were like daggers in Richard's chest. The helplessness he felt was overwhelming. All his money, all his power, all his influence, none of it mattered now. He was just a desperate father, confronting the abyss of his own failures. "What can we do?" asked Olivia, her voice trembling. "Keep talking to him, touching him when possible," replied Dr. Thompson. "Studies show that patients in comas can respond to the presence and voice of loved ones. Also, take care of yourselves. Gabe will need strong parents when he wakes up." When the doctor left, Richard found himself confronted with a reality he had never considered before. His son needed him, not his money or influence, but him, his presence, his love, his voice. That afternoon, while Olivia rested at home at Richard's insistence, he sat beside Gabe's crib and for the first time really looked at his son. He noticed the delicate curve of his eyebrows, so much like Olivia's, the tiny fingers that occasionally moved, the chest that rose and fell with each precious breath. "Hey, son," Richard began, his voice hoarse and unsure. "It's Daddy. I know I haven't been around much, but that's going to change, I promise. You need to fight, okay? Fight to come back to us. I have so much to teach you, so much to learn from you." The tears that Richard had been holding back for so long finally began to fall. He continued talking, the words flowing like a dammed river that finally finds an opening. "Remember that time you smiled at me? It was when you were just 2 months old. I was leaving for a business trip and you flashed that gummy smile. I almost canceled the trip right there. I should have canceled. But I promise, Gabe, when you wake up, I'll be here. I'll be the father you deserve." As he spoke, Richard felt something change in the air. Maybe it was just his imagination, but it seemed like Gabe was listening, responding in some imperceptible way to the monitors, but clear to a father's heart. That's when it happened. A movement so small that it could have gone unnoticed if Richard hadn't been so attentive. Gabe's pinky finger moved just a millimeter, but enough to make Richard's heart leap. "Nurse!" he shouted, without taking his eyes off his son. "Come quick!" The medical team rushed to the bed, checking vital signs and performing quick tests. Richard watched, his heart racing, torn between hope and fear. Dr. Thompson, called in urgently, examined Gabe carefully. After what seemed like an eternity, he turned to Richard with a small smile. "Mr. Miller, it appears your son is responding to stimuli. It's a small progress, but significant. Keep talking to him, maintaining this contact. Every little response is a victory." Richard nodded, unable to speak. When the doctors left, he sat back down next to his son, gently holding his little hand. "Thank you, son," he whispered. "Thank you for fighting. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." That night, as the hospital quieted down, Richard reflected on the changes that had occurred in his life in just 48 hours. The man who entered that hospital was not the same one who now watched over his son's sleep. Something had awakened within him, a long-dormant awareness, a sense of purpose that went beyond material achievements. The Parrot's words came back to his mind. "He is coming back." Could it be that they referred not only to Gabe, but also to a part of Richard that had been lost over the years? As the night progressed, Richard made a silent promise to himself and his son. No matter what happened, he would be a different man, a different father. The journey would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long time, Richard Miller felt he was on the right path. Outside the ICU, the parrot in its cage silently observed the scene, its bright eyes reflecting the soft light of the monitors. And for a moment it seemed that even it nodded in approval at the transformation it was witnessing. The days at Mount Sinai Hospital turned into weeks. Richard Miller, the man who once measured time in fiscal quarters and annual goals, now counted the minutes between each small movement of Gabe, each fluctuation in the monitors that might indicate improvement. The office of Miller Tech, once the center of Richard's universe, now seemed like a distant place, almost irrelevant. He had delegated most of his responsibilities to his trusted team, a decision that would have been unthinkable just a month ago. Now his focus was entirely on his family and Gabe's recovery. On a particularly hot summer afternoon in New York City, Richard was sitting next to Gabe's crib, reading aloud The Little Prince, a book that Olivia had insisted was perfect for stimulating their son. "What is essential is invisible to the eye," read Richard, his soft voice echoing in the quiet of the ICU. You know, son, I think I'm starting to understand what that means." At that moment, Olivia entered the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. She smiled at the scene, something that was becoming more frequent in recent days. "How is he?" she asked, handing a cup to Richard. "Dr. Thompson said his vital signs are stronger today," Richard replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "And I swear I saw his eyes move under his eyelids while I was reading." Olivia nodded, sitting on the other side of the crib. "He'll come back to us, Richard. Our boy is strong." Richard looked at his wife, noticing the dark circles under her eyes, the fatigue on her face. Still, she radiated a strength that he had never truly appreciated before. "Olivia," he began, hesitant, I'm sorry. For everything. For the years of absence, for not being the husband and father you both deserved." Olivia stared at him, surprised by the sudden display of vulnerability. "Richard, No, please let me finish," he gently interrupted. "I spent so much time chasing success, money, power. I thought I was building something important. But now I see that I was just destroying what really mattered." Tears began to form in Olivia's eyes. Richard continued, "I can't change the past, but I promise you and Gabe that I'll be different from now on. If you still want to try. If it's not too late for us." Olivia was silent for a moment, processing her husband's words. Finally, she reached out over Gabe's crib, intertwining her fingers with Richard's. "It's never too late to do the right thing," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm glad you finally understood that." At that moment, a soft sound interrupted the conversation. Richard and Olivia's eyes instantly turned to Gabe. The baby had made a small moan, almost imperceptible, but definitely real. "Gabe!" called Olivia, leaning over the crib. "Son, can you hear us?" Richard pressed the nurse call button, his heart racing. In seconds, the medical team flooded the room, led by Dr. Thompson. After a few tense minutes of examinations and checks, the doctor turned to the anxious couple with a cautious smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, it appears that Gabe is showing signs of emerging from the coma. His reflexes are more responsive, and there's an increase in brain activity. I don't want to create false hopes, but this is definitely a positive development." Richard and Olivia embraced, tears of relief and hope running down their faces. It was a small step, but it meant the world to them. In the weeks that followed, Richard's life underwent a profound transformation. He completely reorganized his routine, spending most of his time at the hospital with Gabe and Olivia. When he needed to deal with company matters, he did so from the hospital itself, often with the laptop balanced on his lap while holding his son's hand. One day, as he walked down the corridor towards the coffee machine, Richard heard a familiar voice coming from the waiting room. It was the parrot repeating its enigmatic phrase, "He is coming back." Intrigued, Richard entered the room. The bird stared at him with its bright eyes, tilting its head to the side. "Who is coming back?" Richard asked softly, feeling a bit foolish for talking to a bird. To his surprise, the parrot responded, "Love. Love is coming back." Richard stood paralyzed, trying to process what he had just heard. Was it possible that these words had some deeper meaning? Or was it just his tired mind creating connections where none existed? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor. It was a nurse running towards Gabe's room. With his heart in his throat, Richard ran back, fearing the worst. But as he entered the room, he was greeted by a sight he would never forget. Gabe had his eyes open, blinking slowly, his gaze focused on Olivia, who was crying with joy. Dr. Thompson was beside the crib, a wide smile on his normally serious face. "He's awake," announced the doctor, his voice overflowing with satisfaction. "And he's responding well to stimuli. We'll need to do more tests, but this is extremely promising." Richard approached the crib, barely able to believe what he was seeing. Gabe turned his head slightly in his direction, his curious little eyes fixing on his father. "Hey, champ," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "Welcome back." At that moment, something definitely changed within Richard Miller. The last barriers he had built over the years completely crumbled. Tears ran freely down his face, But for the first time in his adult life, he didn't care about showing vulnerability. Olivia joined him, and the three, father, mother, and son, shared a silent embrace, full of unspoken promises and renewed hopes. In the days that followed, as Gabe continued to gradually improve, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The parrot's words echoed in his mind. Love is coming back, and he realized that it wasn't just Gabe who was returning to life, it was himself. The man who had once defined success in terms of profits and acquisitions now saw true value in the little things. Gabe's first post-coma smile, Olivia's grateful handshake, Dr. Thompson's look of approval as he saw the family's dedication. One afternoon, while Gabe slept peacefully, now out of the ICU and in a regular room, Richard took out his phone and made a call that had been pending for a long time. "Patricia, it's Richard. I need you to cancel all my meetings for the next month and schedule a meeting with the board. I have some important changes to discuss." Hanging up the phone, Richard looked at Olivia, who was watching him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "What are you planning?" she asked. Richard smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his eyes in a way Olivia hadn't seen in years. "I'm reordering my priorities," he replied. "Miller Tech will continue, but not at the expense of my family. I'm thinking of reducing my role, maybe working more from home." Olivia interrupted him with a soft kiss. "Who are you and what have you done with my husband?" she joked, but her eyes shone with happiness. Richard chuckled softly, careful not to wake Gabe. "Let's just say I finally understood what's really important in life." As the sun set over New York City, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Richard Miller felt a peace he had never experienced before. The path ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he was eager to see what the future held. Outside the window, a parrot flew across the sky, its colorful plumage shining against the twilight, and for a moment, Richard could have sworn he heard a distant voice say, "Love has returned." The return home was a moment of joy mixed with apprehension for the Miller family. After almost 2 months in the hospital, Gabe finally received discharge, still fragile but recovering promisingly. Richard and Olivia entered the apartment with the baby in their arms, looking around as if seeing the place for the first time. "Welcome home, my love," whispered Olivia, gently kissing Gabe's forehead. Richard put the bags down and took a deep breath. The apartment, once merely a stopping point in his busy professional life, now seemed vibrant and full of possibilities. He noticed details he had never perceived before. The family photos on the wall, Gabe's toys scattered around the living room, the soft aroma of Olivia's perfume in the air. "I'll prepare Gabe's room," said Richard, picking up one of the bags. "Do you need anything?" Olivia looked at her husband with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "No, thank you. I'll just sit with him here in the living room for a bit." As he arranged the baby's room, Richard reflected on the changes that had occurred in his life over the past few weeks. The meeting with the Miller Tech board had been tense but productive. He had announced his intention to reduce his role in the company, delegating more responsibilities and focusing on a better balance between work and personal life. "Mr. Miller," he remembered one of the directors saying, "I understand your personal situation, but the company needs your leadership. How can we ensure that Miller Tech will continue to thrive?" Richard had responded with a conviction that surprised even himself. "Miller Tech will thrive because I finally understood that success isn't measured just by numbers on a balance sheet. We're going to create a work culture that values both performance and employee well-being. I believe this will make us even stronger and more innovative." Returning to the present, Richard finished arranging the crib and went back to the living room. The scene he found melted his heart. Olivia had fallen asleep on the couch, with Gabe nestled on her chest, also sleeping deeply. Silently, Richard took out his cell phone and snapped a picture, not to post on social media or share with work colleagues, but for himself, as a reminder of what really mattered. In the weeks that followed, Richard dove headfirst into his new routine. He woke up early to feed Gabe, allowing Olivia to sleep a little longer. He spent mornings working from home, participating in video conferences and responding to emails. In the afternoons, he dedicated himself entirely to his family, taking Gabe for walks in the park or simply playing with him on the living room rug. One afternoon, while playing peekaboo with Gabe, Richard heard the doorbell ring. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see Patricia, his secretary, standing there with a worried expression. "Mr. Miller, I'm sorry to bother you at home, but we have an urgent situation at the office. The Omega project is having problems, and the investors are demanding your presence for an emergency meeting." Richard felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the instinct to rush to the office and fix everything, but then he heard Gabe's laughter coming from the living room, and something clicked inside him. "Patricia," he said calmly, "I appreciate you coming all the way here, but I can't go to the office now. Please reschedule the meeting for tomorrow morning. I'll be there at 9 a.m. sharp." The secretary looked shocked. "But sir, the investors can wait until tomorrow," Richard gently interrupted. "My son can't. I trust you and the team to handle any immediate emergency. I'll see you in the morning." Closing the door, Richard returned to the living room, where Gabe was waiting for him with outstretched arms. Picking up his son, he felt a wave of peace and certainty that he had never experienced before in his career. "Did you just refuse an emergency meeting?" asked Olivia, who had witnessed the scene from the kitchen. Richard nodded, smiling. "Some emergencies are more important than others." That night, after putting Gabe to bed, Richard and Olivia sat on the balcony, enjoying the night view of New York City. The silence between them was comfortable, full of mutual understanding. "You know," Olivia began, breaking the silence, "when you said you were going to change, I confess I had my doubts. I thought it would be temporary, that you'd soon go back to being the workaholic you always were." Richard took her hand, caressing it softly. "I had my doubts too, but each day that passes, I'm more certain that I'm on the right path. It's not easy. Sometimes I miss the adrenaline of the office, but, Olivia encouraged, "but nothing compares to hearing Gabe's laughter, to seeing you smile, to feeling that I'm really present in your lives." Olivia leaned in and kissed him softly. "I'm proud of you, Richard, and happy for us." The next morning, Richard prepared to go to the office for the first time in weeks. As he adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, he noticed something different in his reflection. His eyes seemed clearer, his face more relaxed. It was as if the weight of the world had been removed from his shoulders. Before leaving, he went to Gabe's room. The baby was still sleeping peacefully. Richard leaned over the crib, gently kissing his son's forehead. "Daddy's going to work now, champ," he whispered, "but I promise I'll be back soon. We have a lot to explore together." On the way to the office, Richard reflected on the challenges that awaited him. He knew that not everyone would understand or approve of his new priorities. There would be resistance, doubts, maybe even attempts to undermine his authority. But for the first time in his career, he felt truly prepared to face any obstacle. As he entered the imposing Miller Tech building, Richard was greeted with curious looks and whispers from employees. Many hadn't seen him in weeks, and rumors about his attitude changes had spread quickly. In the meeting room, the investors and directors were already waiting for him, some with expressions of concern, others of skepticism. Richard took a deep breath, adjusted his tie one last time, and opened the door. "Good morning, everyone," he said with quiet confidence. "Before we start discussing the Omega project, I'd like to share some ideas about the future of Miller Tech. I believe it's time for us to not only innovate in technology, but also in the way we work and live." As he began his presentation, Richard felt a different energy flowing through him. It wasn't the old frantic urgency to close deals at any cost, but rather a serene determination to build something truly meaningful, both for the company and for the people who were part of it. On the other side of the city, in the Miller's apartment, Olivia was playing with Gabe in the living room. The baby laughed loudly, a sound full of joy and innocence, and at that moment, as if sensing the change in the air, he looked at the family photo on the wall and pointed to Richard's image. "Dada," babbled Gabe, speaking his first word. Olivia, emotional, picked up her son and hugged him tightly. "Yes, my love, Dada, and he's going to be very happy when he hears about this." The sun was shining brightly outside, promising a new day full of possibilities. For the Miller family, and for all those touched by their journey, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one in which success would be measured not just by professional achievements, but by the depth of human connections and the joy of shared moments. The following months brought a series of challenges and discoveries for Richard Miller. The implementation of his new policies at Miller Tech was not without obstacles. Many executives and shareholders, accustomed to the frantic pace and relentless work culture that Richard had cultivated for years, resisted the change. On a particularly tense afternoon, Richard found himself facing a group of discontented investors in the company's main meeting room. "Mr. Miller," argued one of them, Charles Vance, known for his aggressive approach to business, "these new wellness and work-life balance policies are affecting our productivity. The numbers for the last quarter are concerning." Richard took a deep breath, remembering the lessons he had learned in recent months. "Mr. Vance, I understand your concern, but I ask you to look beyond the immediate numbers. We're investing in our most valuable asset, our people." He stood up and walked to the whiteboard in the room, beginning to sketch a graph. "Look, our talent retention rates have increased by 30% since the implementation of these policies. Employee satisfaction levels are at their highest point in 5 years. And our innovation indices, they've skyrocketed." The investors exchanged glances, some still skeptical, others beginning to show interest. "But what about the profits?" insisted another shareholder. Richard smiled, confident. "The profits will come. In fact, they're already coming. Our new project, developed by a team working flexible hours and with ample wellness support, is about to be launched. The market projections are extremely positive." By the end of the meeting, although not everyone was fully convinced, Richard felt he had planted an important seed. Miller Tech wasn't just changing, it was evolving. Leaving the office that night, Richard received a message from Olivia. "Gabe took his first steps today. Come home soon." With his heart racing with emotion, Richard quickened his pace. On the way, he passed a park where he saw parents playing with their children. The scene, which he would have barely noticed before, now filled him with anticipation and joy. When he arrived home, he was greeted by a wobbling Gabe, taking uncertain steps towards him with a toothless smile. Olivia was filming the scene, tears of happiness in her eyes. "Dada!" exclaimed Gabe, falling into Richard's open arms. At that moment, all the stresses of the day dissipated. Richard hugged his son, feeling a wave of love and gratitude so intense it almost left him breathless. "Did you see?" asked Olivia, emotional. "He waited for you to come home to take his first real steps." Richard nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it was choked with emotion. "Thank you for calling me. I wouldn't have missed this for the world." Later, after putting Gabe to bed, Richard and Olivia sat on the balcony, as they had done so many nights in recent months. The city sparkled below, but the real spectacle was in the connection between them. "How was work today?" asked Olivia, pouring a glass of wine for each of them. Richard sighed, taking a sip. "Difficult, but necessary. I'm starting to see real changes, you know, not just in the numbers, but in the people. Today, an employee thanked me because she was able to attend her daughter's piano recital for the first time in years." Olivia smiled, squeezing her husband's hand. "You're making a difference, Richard, not just for our family, but for many others." "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough," Richard confessed, "if I'm balancing everything correctly." "Nobody's perfect," Olivia replied softly. "The important thing is that you're trying every day, and that means a lot." The next morning, Richard woke up early as usual, but instead of immediately checking emails or making calls, he went to Gabe's room. The boy was still sleeping peacefully. Richard stood there for a moment, watching his son. He remembered the days in the hospital, the feeling of helplessness and fear. And now, seeing Gabe grow strong and healthy, he felt a renewed determination. Returning to the bedroom, he found Olivia waking up. "Good morning," she murmured sleepily. "Good morning, love," Richard replied, leaning in to kiss her. "I had an idea. How about we take a day off today? We could take Gabe to the beach, have a picnic." Olivia sat up, surprised. "But what about work? Don't you have that important presentation today?" Richard smiled. "The presentation can wait until tomorrow. Some things are more important." As they prepared for their impromptu beach day, Richard sent a message to Patricia, his secretary. "Please reschedule all of today's commitments. I'm taking a family day. I'll only be available for real emergencies." At the beach, watching Gabe take his first steps on the sand, laughing and pointing at the waves, Richard felt a peace he had never experienced before in his life. Olivia, smiling beside him, seemed equally content. "I don't know," said Richard, watching Gabe play with a small sand bucket. "I think I finally understood what real success is." Olivia looked at him, curious. "And what is it?" Richard smiled, hugging her. It's this, being present, building memories, making a difference not just in the business world, but in the lives of the people we love. As the sun set over the ocean, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, the Miller family remained on the beach, savoring every moment together. Richard knew there would be more challenges ahead, more balances to be struck. But there, with the sand between his toes and the sound of his son's laughter in the background, he felt he was exactly where he should be. Back at the apartment, late at night, with Gabe asleep in his arms, Richard paused before placing him in the crib. Looking at his son's serene face, he whispered a promise. "I'll keep trying every day to be the best father and person I can be. Not out of obligation, but because I've discovered that this is what truly makes me happy." That night, as the city outside continued its frantic pace, the Miller home was enveloped in an atmosphere of peace and contentment. Richard fell asleep with a smile on his face, eager for what the new day would bring, not just in terms of business, but in precious moments with his family. And somewhere, perhaps in a dream or perhaps in reality, the parrot that had once warned him softly repeated, "Love has returned, and this time it will stay." Gabe's first birthday after his recovery was a milestone, not just for the Miller family, but for all who had followed their journey. Richard and Olivia decided to celebrate with an intimate party in their home's garden, a space that was once rarely used, but had now become the heart of many family moments. As he helped Olivia hang colorful balloons, Richard reflected on the past year. So many changes, so many challenges, but also so much joy. Gabe's laughter, echoing through the garden as he played with his new toys, was living proof that all the difficult decisions had been worth it. "What are you thinking about?" asked Olivia, noticing her husband's distant look. Richard smiled, taking her hand. "About how life can change in a year. Remember how I used to be? Always running, always absent?" Olivia nodded, squeezing his hand back. "I remember, but I also remember how you faced everything, how you decided to change. That's what matters." The party was a success. Close friends, family members, and even some of Richard's work colleagues attended, many commenting on the notable change not just in the host, but in the overall atmosphere of the Miller family. Among the guests was Charles Vance, the investor who months earlier had harshly questioned Richard's new policies at Miller Tech. Approaching Richard, who was holding Gabe in his arms, Charles seemed a bit uncomfortable. "Richard," he began, "I wanted to apologize." Richard raised an eyebrow, surprised. "For what, Charles?" "For doubting you, the changes you proposed in the company. The results speak for themselves. Not only have the numbers improved, but the company culture. It's inspiring." Richard smiled, bouncing Gabe, who was laughing cheerfully. "Thank you, Charles. That means a lot. You know, I learned that success isn't just about profits. It's about creating an environment where people can thrive, both at work and at home." Charles nodded, looking at Gabe. Can I hold him for a bit?" Richard hesitated for a moment, remembering the relentless Charles from the boardrooms, but seeing the sincerity in his eyes, he carefully handed Gabe over. Charles's moment with Gabe was brief, but significant. The tough businessman seemed to melt while holding the laughing baby. When he returned Gabe to Richard, there was a new light in his eyes. "You know, Richard," said Charles, his voice softer than usual, "maybe I need to reevaluate some things in my life too." As the party continued, Richard noticed something in the corner of the garden that made him pause. An empty golden cage hanging from a tree. He didn't remember putting it there. Approaching it, Richard saw a small note attached to the cage. Carefully, he opened it and read, "Sometimes we need to free ourselves from our own cages to truly live. Congratulations on finding the key." There was no signature, but Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. Looking around, he could almost swear he saw a flash of colorful feathers disappearing into the sky. Returning to the party, Richard joined Olivia, who was chatting animatedly with a group of friends. She looked at him, noticing something different in his expression. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. Richard nodded, smiling. "More than okay. I'm happy, truly happy." As the afternoon progressed, guests began to say their goodbyes. Richard and Olivia, with Gabe asleep in their arms, waved the last farewells. Alone again, the small family cuddled on the living room sofa. Gabe, exhausted from the party, slept deeply between his parents. It was a perfect day, whispered Olivia, caressing her son's hair. Richard agreed, but there was something in his eyes, a mixture of contentment and determination. "Olivia," he began, hesitant, "I've been thinking—" She looked at him, curious. "About what?" "About expanding our family," he said softly. "What do you think about giving Gabe a little brother or sister?" Olivia's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Are you sure? With everything that's happened, with the changes in the company?" Richard gently interrupted her. "I'm more sure of this than any business decision I've ever made. This past year has shown me what really matters, and what matters is this, our family." Olivia kissed him softly, careful not to wake Gabe. "Then I guess we have a new project ahead of us, Mr. Miller." Richard chuckled quietly. "And this will be the most important project of our lives." That night, after putting Gabe to bed, Richard paused on the balcony, looking out at the city that never sleeps. But now, instead of seeing only business opportunities and professional achievements, he saw a world of possibilities for his family. The phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from Patricia. "Reminder, tomorrow, 9 a.m., presentation of Miller Tech's new social responsibility project." Richard smiled. The project, his latest initiative, aimed to create daycare centers and family support spaces within Miller Tech's partner companies. It was a way to extend the change he had experienced in his personal life to a broader impact on society. Replying to the message with a simple "thank you," Richard went back inside. In the bedroom, Olivia was already sleeping peacefully. He lay down beside her, pulling her close. As sleep enveloped him, Richard thought about all the changes of the past months. The journey hadn't been easy, but every challenge, every moment of doubt had been worth it. The man who once defined success only by numbers on a spreadsheet now understood that true wealth lay in shared moments, in lives touched, in love given and received. And so, with a heart full of gratitude and hope for the future, Richard Miller fell asleep, eager for the new day and all the adventures it would bring, both in the business world and in the warmth of his home. The months turned into years, and the Miller family's life blossomed in ways Richard could never have imagined. Gabe, now 4 years old, was a vibrant and curious boy, always asking questions about the world around him, and by his side, running through the apartment with contagious laughter, was Sophie, the 2-year-old little sister, who had arrived to complete the family. On a sunny Saturday morning, Richard watched his children playing in the park near their home. Olivia, sitting beside him on the bench, rested her head on his shoulder. "Who would have thought, huh?" she commented with a smile. "The great Richard Miller, spending a Saturday morning at the playground." Richard laughed, hugging her tighter. "And there's no place in the world I'd rather be." As the children played, Richard reflected on the path that had brought him here. Miller Tech had transformed over the past few years, not just in terms of profits, which surprisingly had increased, but in its culture and social impact. The social responsibility project that had begun with daycare centers in partner companies had expanded. Now Miller Tech was recognized as a leader in work-life balance practices and family support. Other companies in the sector were beginning to follow its example, creating a wave of change in the American corporate world. "Daddy, Daddy!" Sophie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. The girl was running towards him, her dark curls bouncing in the wind. "Look what I found!" In her little hands she held a colorful feather, shining under the morning sun. Richard felt a familiar shiver run down his spine. "It's beautiful, my love. Where did you find it?" Sophie pointed to a nearby tree. "There was a big, colorful bird." Richard exchanged a significant look with Olivia. She smiled, understanding without words the connection that simple feather had to their journey. Back at the apartment while the children napped, Richard found himself on the balcony, the colorful feather in his hands. Olivia joined him, bringing 2 cups of coffee. "Do you still think about it sometimes?" she asked softly. Richard nodded. "The parrot? Yes. It's strange, but I feel like it was a guide somehow. Its words changed everything." Olivia took the feather, examining it. "You know, sometimes I wonder if it was real or if it was some kind of symbol, a wake-up call for you." "Real or not," Richard replied, "I'm grateful. For it, for you, for everything that happened, even the difficult moments." Richard's phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was Patricia. "Mr. Miller?" I'm sorry to bother you on the weekend, but we have a situation. Leaders of Tomorrow magazine wants to do a cover story about you and the changes at Miller Tech. They want to schedule an interview and a photo shoot for next week. Richard hesitated for a moment. In the past, he would have jumped at an opportunity like this. Now, his priorities were different. Patricia, let's do this. Schedule the interview for Tuesday afternoon, but with one condition. I want the photo shoot to be here at home, with my family. If they want to tell my story, let them tell the whole story. Hanging up the phone, he turned to Olivia, who was looking at him with a mixture of surprise and pride. Are you sure? She asked. Exposing our family life like that? Richard smiled, taking her hands. I am. If my journey can inspire other people to reevaluate their priorities, to find a balance, then it's worth sharing. On Tuesday, the Miller apartment was transformed into an impromptu studio. Photographers adjusted lights while the journalist prepared her questions. Gabe and Sophie, excited by all the commotion, ran from one side to the other, charming the team with their energy. The interview flowed naturally. Richard spoke about the challenges of changing an ingrained corporate culture, about the fear of failure, about the joy of rediscovering what really mattered in life. Mr. Miller, asked the journalist, many still see success as synonymous with total dedication to work, often at the expense of personal life. What would you say to them? Richard thought for a moment, looking at Olivia and the children playing in the background. I'd say that true success isn't measured just by professional achievements or bank accounts. It's measured by the depth of our connections, by the positive impact we have on others' lives, by the peace we feel at the end of the day. He paused, smiling, as he saw Sophie approach with a drawing she had just made. I'd say it's possible to build a professional legacy without sacrificing what's most precious, time with those we love. When the magazine team finally left, it was already night. Richard helped Olivia put the children to bed, reading them the story that had become a nightly ritual, a story about a wise parrot that helped people find their true path. Later, alone on the balcony, Richard and Olivia contemplated the illuminated city. You know, said Richard, breaking the silence, when I think about the future now, I don't just think about business goals or company expansions. I think about seeing Gabe and Sophie grow up, about being there for every important moment. Olivia smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. And that's why you're an extraordinary man, Richard Miller. Because you understood that the greatest investment we can make is in our family, in our love. That night, as the city outside continued its frantic pace, the Miller home was an oasis of peace and contentment. Richard fell asleep with a smile on his face, grateful for every challenge, every lesson learned, every precious moment with his family. And in his dreams, he saw a colorful parrot flying free over the city, its feathers shining under the sun, reminding him that sometimes, to truly live, we need to have the courage to open the doors of our own cages. 10 years had passed since that fateful night in the hospital, when Richard Miller's life changed forever. Now at 55, Richard found himself once again in a hospital room, but the circumstances couldn't be more different. Gabe, now a 14-year-old teenager, was sitting in a nearby chair, absorbed in a book about social entrepreneurship. Sophie, at 12, was animatedly drawing in a notebook. And at the center of it all, Olivia held in her arms the newest member of the Miller family, Marina, born just a few hours earlier. Richard observed the scene with his heart overflowing with emotion. Each face in that room represented a crucial part of his journey, a living reminder of the choices he had made and the path he had decided to follow. "Dad," called Gabe, looking up from his book, "do you think we could implement something like this in Miller Tech Jr.?" Richard smiled, remembering the project he had started a few years ago, a division of the company focused on teaching entrepreneurship and social responsibility to young people. Gabe had shown a genuine interest in the family business from an early age, but always with an eye towards social impact. "Of course we can, son. Why don't we prepare a presentation together for the next board meeting?" Gabe's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. It was a reflection of Richard himself years ago, but with a wisdom and social awareness that the younger Richard would have taken years to develop. Sophie, noticing the conversation, held up her drawing. "Look, Daddy, I drew our family." Richard took the paper, his heart warming as he saw the colorful representation of all of them, including the newly arrived Marina. In the corner of the drawing, to his surprise, was a colorful parrot. "Sophie," he asked softly, "why did you draw a parrot?" The girl shrugged, smiling. "I don't know, I just felt like it should be there. Like it was part of our story, you know?" Richard exchanged a meaningful look with Olivia, who smiled back, understanding perfectly. At that moment, a nurse entered the room. "Mr. Miller? There's someone who wants to see you. Said it's important." Intrigued, Richard left the room, promising to return soon. In the corridor, to his surprise, he found Charles Vance, the former skeptical investor who over the years had become one of the biggest supporters of Miller Tech's social responsibility initiatives. "Charles, what are you doing here?" The older man smiled, extending his hand. "I came to congratulate the new dad, of course, and also, well, I have a proposal for you." Richard raised an eyebrow, curious. "What kind of proposal?" "I'm retiring," explained Charles, "and I want to do something meaningful with my time and resources. Inspired by what you did with Miller Tech, I thought about creating a foundation focused on promoting work-life balance and family well-being in companies. I'd like you to be my advisor on this project." Richard was momentarily speechless, moved by the magnitude of the impact his choices had had not only on his life, but on so many others. "Charles, it would be an honor," he finally replied. "In fact, I'm sure Gabe would love to get involved too. He has some brilliant ideas about social entrepreneurship." The two men talked for a few minutes, outlining plans and possibilities. When Charles said goodbye, Richard stood in the corridor for a moment, reflecting on the path he had traveled. Returning to the room, he was greeted by the sight of his family gathered. Olivia looked at him, noticing something in his expression. "Everything okay, love?" Richard nodded, approaching to gently kiss Marina's forehead. "More than okay, just grateful for everything." That night, after Gabe and Sophie had fallen asleep on improvised sofas in the hospital room, Richard found himself alone on the floor's balcony observing the city. New York City sparkled under the moonlight, a sight that had always enchanted him. Closing his eyes, he allowed himself to go back in time. He remembered the relentless executive he had once been, the fear and helplessness he had felt on that first night in the hospital with Gabe, the enigmatic words of the parrot, the countless decisions and changes over the years. A soft flapping of wings made him open his eyes. There, perched on the balcony railing, was a parrot with vibrant plumage, its bright eyes fixed on Richard. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to his surprise, the bird spoke. Love came back, and it stayed. Before Richard could react, the parrot spread its wings and took flight, disappearing into the New York night. Richard stood there, a mix of emotions enveloping him. He didn't know if what he had seen was real or a product of his tired imagination, but it didn't matter. The message was clear and true. Returning to the room, Richard observed his sleeping family. Olivia, exhausted but radiant, held Marina close to her chest. Gabe and Sophie, their faces serene in sleep, were living testimony to his choices and his love. Taking a piece of paper and a pen, Richard began to write. It wasn't a financial report or a business plan, but a letter to his younger self, to the man he had been so long ago. "Dear Richard," he wrote, "you don't know this yet, but you're about to embark on the most important journey of your life. It won't be easy. There will be moments of doubt, fear, regret. But I promise you that every step, every difficult decision, every moment of vulnerability will be worth it. Because in the end, you'll discover that true success isn't measured by professional achievements or bank accounts. It's measured by the love you give and receive, by the lives you touch, by the difference you make in the world. So when life gives you the chance to choose between what you've always known and the unknown, have courage. Choose love. Choose family. Choose to be present. For it's in these choices that you'll find your true wealth, your true purpose. And always remember, what is essential is invisible to the eye, but you'll learn to see it with your heart." Folding the letter, Richard put it in his pocket. He knew he would never send it, that it was impossible to change the past. But writing those words was his way of honoring the journey, of acknowledging every step that had brought him here. Sitting next to Olivia, he gently took Marina's hand. The little one gripped his finger with surprising strength, as if sealing a silent promise. And there, in that hospital room full of love and possibilities, Richard Miller knew with absolute certainty he had found his true treasure, his true legacy. not in the corridors of an office or in the pages of a financial statement, but in the smiles of his children, in the love of his wife, and in the peace he had finally found in his heart. The circle was complete. And the journey, far from ending, was just beginning.